Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. What's good, y'all? Pearson here, back at it again with yet another edition of Coffee with Comrades. This week, I hung out with my pal Frank from the Left Page podcast and talked about Ursula K. Guin's novel, The Left Hand of Darkness. In the ensuing dialogue, Frank and I discussed the book's ambisexuality, queer critiques of the text and Le Guin's response, the nature of being and the impermanence of knowledge, how different knowledge bases are gendered, and how we dismantle and reinterrogate the chauvinistic approach to science and reclaim a more emancipatory framework for the scientific method. We also talk a lot about spirituality. I don't know, it was a lot. We bounced around quite a bit, but I had a blast, and I hope that you'll enjoy this episode too. Before we get there, though, I want to open with a couple quick announcements. First things first, the Macabre Media podcast just came out with another brand new episode. Our Kaiju miniseries continues with the discussion of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Kong, which are, as far as I'm concerned, the cinematic equivalent of a dumpster fire. That said, if you want to hear grumpy old me get all curmudgeonly and critique the film's shallow anthropocentrism and ecology, or you're just a fan of big monsters hitting each other a lot, check it out. You can find a link in the show notes. Oddly enough, we got our first DCMA takedown this week for playing 2 different Kendrick Lamar songs in episodes of our podcast, so we're going to stop putting song titles in the episode descriptions of our podcasts in hopes of making it a little less obvious what music we're playing. I don't want to nix music from the show entirely, as I know it's something that a lot of folks have said they really love about our podcast. So if you ever want to know what a song is, henceforth, just shoot us an email or slide into our DMs on social media, and we'll be happy to tell you. Frankly, I'm honestly kind of impressed that it took 126 episodes for this to happen, but what do you know? Here we are. Coffee with Comrades is a podcast made by workers for workers. If you dig these conversations we have week after week, you can sign up to support our work by going to www.patreon.com/Coffee with Comrades. Our program relies on the generosity of listeners just like you, who, month after month, choose to keep this show afloat with their financial support. But we're also a podcast committed to keeping our content ad-free and available to all. So if you're not in a position where you can back this show with a monthly contribution, literally no worries at all. If you do still want to support the program, there are many ways you can do so. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. You can share our episodes whenever they go live. You can pick up stickers, or you can simply tell your friends and comrades that you like this podcast. Last thing, Coffee with Comrades is a proud affiliate of the Rev Left Radio Federation, just like our co-conspirators on today's episode, and we're also a member of the Channel Zero Network, populated by awesome shows like this one.
We will never, ever surrender or compromise. We occupied government buildings, we blockaded highways, and we talked about not just marching, but direct action to shut this shit down.
Here we draw the line. Right here we say no more.
Yate, we invite you to join us for Indigenous Action, a podcast where we dig deep into critical issues impacting our communities in the occupied lands known as the so-called United States, or what many people recognize as Turtle Island.
This is an autonomous, anti-colonial broadcast with unapologetic and claws-out analysis towards total liberation.
So take your seat by this fire, and may the bridges we burn together light our way.
Fuel that fire so it's a blazing fire that they can never stop.
Find us at indigenousaction.org and with the Channel Zero Network.
All right, y'all, I think that does it for us today. It brings me great pleasure to present episode 126 of Coffee with Comrades, Permanent, Intolerable Uncertainty, The Left Hand of Darkness, featuring Frank Lopez of The Left Page.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the left page. I am Frank, your always online historian, academic, researcher, writer, podcaster, lots of different things. And I am here today with an incredible guest to do almost a sort of second part, or a continuing part, to a discussion we've had some time ago on Ursula K. Guin. I am joined today by the incredible Pearson Bolt from Coffee with Comrades. Welcome.
What's up, Frank? I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad that we can continue collaborating and talking about Ursula K. Le Guin and talking about literature. It's an honor to be here. I'm a huge fan of the left page, and I'm excited to chat with you today. It's gonna be a fun conversation.
Exactly. Like it's the second part, or it's a continuing part, because there's more Ursula Le Guin out there. So
Indeed. One of these days we'll have to circle back and do like another book in the Hainish cycle, or do like the Wizard of Earthsea or some shit. That would be fun. I'll just be your like resident like Ursula K. Le Guin stan.
I mean, you did bring her to light for me, and I am literally planning to do my master's on her work. So, and on the Dispossessed.
Nice. That's awesome.
So,
as we talk, I'm actually I'm not literally writing right now while we're recording this podcast, but as we record this podcast, I'm working on my dissertation, and the first chapter of it is on Ursula K. Le Guin, and specifically on the Dispossessed. So I'm definitely thinking about all this stuff. It's all bubbling around in my noggin.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, I'm happy about that.
Yeah, for sure.
Last time we spoke about Dispossessed, and this time we are with The Left Hand of Darkness, which is another incredible book. It's effectively later in the Hainish cycle, in just the way the plot is structured and that overarching narrative, which we only get a few snippets of in various books. But it is written earlier, actually. The Dispossessed is from 1974, and The Left Hand of Darkness is from 1969. And it's...
Nice.
Oh, exactly. And it's just such an incredible... It's a really great experiment, the Left Hand of Darkness, and I think with its limitations and what it's doing, it's quite fun, and we're going to get into what it effectively does, the whole experiment with gender and a sort of androgynous and bi-gender identity species, or humanoid species. But there's a whole discussion of how Le Guin herself understood the text and reflections on it in time afterwards. So there's definitely a lot on just this one point, but hopefully we'll also be able to touch on a lot of different things. To give like a brief sort of plot summary to get us started, it is the story of Guin AI, or Guin I don't know. I had with various sci-fi things, I always have certain difficulty pronouncing things, because in my head they sound something. When you say them aloud, they mean something else.
Right. Yeah. Totally. When I taught this book with my students, they had a similar. They're like, "Is it Guin AI? Is he an AI? Is he a robot?" And I was like, "All right, I think it's just the stylization of his name. I don't think we need to like read that far into it, y'all." I've always called him Guin I, but like I think it works either way. There's unless Ursula K. Le Guin like explicitly said otherwise, or we can find like a like an iteration of her reading it aloud. I'm not sure if there is like ever a definitive translation or pronunciation for characters. So I'm not gonna lose any sleep over it.
Yeah, no, me neither. Just one of those fun things, especially because I read in Portuguese,
sure.
which was fun.
Oh, did you read the translation?
Yes, in a beautiful cover. Like people can't see it, but it'll be on like the Twitter publication, which is just a beautiful cover.
Wow, that is gorgeous. Yeah.
I mean, I will show you the Dispossessed later because it's in another room, but it's the same sort of art style, and it's really good. like hardcover, nice
Yeah,
edition.
it's got that like that sort of neo-futurist kind of aesthetic.
Which I think makes a lot of sense. I'd be pressed to give a clear like, oh, this is what the cover is actually representing, but it's good looking,
Right.
It's nice.
Yeah, my cover is much more bland. It's just the like frozen giant face, which is like fine, but like it's definitely not as eye-catching or visually arresting as yours. I'm a little bit jealous, Frank, if I'm being honest. I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but let's be honest, we all judge books by their covers. And
Naturally.
that's a mighty fine cover you got there.
Oh yeah, and I think it's good because one of the big things about the research I'm doing, well, it's sort of in the back of my mind because to actually do that sort of understanding and idea is a bit harder to prove or go after, but while the Guin has been translated into Portuguese since the 70s, there's been virtually or effectively no critical or any reception at all. So
Interesting.
yeah, I'm like boggled because like Dispossessed, for example, 74, in 75 I found an edition, and subsequent editions in like 78 I think, or 80 something. So there were others, but no one talked about them, and I found no other work on it, barely on her.
Right, so it must have been selling. People must have been reading it, but nobody was like actually like doing scholarship on it. That's so fascinating. I wonder why it flew under the radar for so long.
Yeah, it's interesting, and the more I read into like the reception of it, I'm like, there's been a lot of work in the US, in the UK, like even in Australia, sci-fi on the Guin, on utopias and dystopias. So like, that's just not been as much a thing here or at all. So yeah, it's fun.
Right.
It's fun to be able to like, because that's the point of what I'm doing, building that sort of bridge, which is great. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, anyway, we thought in The Left Hand of Darkness, we have the story of Ganley AI. I'll probably switch between the different pronunciations, which is fine, as he arrives in the planet of Gethin, or Winter, as a sort of emissary of the Ecumen, which is... We'll get into what it is, what it tries to do, and how we can think about it later, but it's a sort of, like a space UN kind of thing, but it does a lot more. It's this sort of cultural, spiritual, political conglomerate of planets and things, and it, in order to sort of expand and incorporate other planets and peoples and cultures into it, it sends its emissaries. It has an initial one-person incognito scouting force, really, to sort of, this is the planet, these are some of the cultural or biological and even like geographical sense of the planet and the people. And then there's a one-man emissary who announces themselves and presents as like, this is what I'm here to do, and try to build this connection as best as they can, or fail to do so. And it's in a way this journey of this outsider in these like larger realms, so to speak, and how he interacts with the people, and has similarly to the Dispossessed, a sort of circular journey, and how there's it's similar to that utopia narrative of like the outsider going into the utopia and how he relates to it, the connections, the ideas, differences, and how that's different to his world. In this case, it's not utopian at all, but it follows that similar structure, which allows for a lot of different world building, and it's just really interesting. And the main focus of like the experiment, while there are a lot of different things at play, is the main one of gender, where like you have these ambisexual human beings who are about, most of the time, they are androgynous with no real sexual differentiation, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, and then it's like 3 days out of the lunar cycle, they will manifest either like male sex or female sex organs, and have the ability to procreate, and they enter into like like essentially like they enter into heat. Like,
Yes.
you know, like they can't have sex without being, you know, in this particular period in time. And so like basically like all work stops and they just all fuck each other.
Which is quite a fun image, to be honest. It's like, when you need to, you go for it.
Yeah,
Fine.
you know, I mean, hey, if you gotta go, you gotta go.
And well, the main thing is that like the outsider is just a human man, and how he relates and how he talks about it. I'm always interested in like the meta text of like if the book we're reading is it exists in universe, and in this case it does. It's in full Genli I's sort of testimony or report of how things went and his experience, along with a few other different like legends and other texts and previous reports. So it's definitely an interesting text on just the perspective that we're given, which is fairly limited, but it also helps to show like some of the inherent biases there, which are there's a matter of language, which
Numerous.
just like the language, the whole thing, and it's definitely interesting. But just like because of that, it's because it uses a sort of unifying he, and it sort of leads to the idea that like, oh, like they're not men, but the language presses into that direction. And it is interesting that Le Guin herself like recognized that stance many years later, and I was like, yeah, no, I there were alternatives. I could have done them, but I was like, I didn't know. Fine, like that's the process of learning. Like you screw up, you make mistakes, and that's not an issue. That's actually how it goes. So that's definitely
it was so interesting talking about this text with like my students who were like aware, right, of like, you know, different pronouns and like how people think about gender now in like the year 2020, like it's so radically different. Well, it's 2021 now, but I taught this book last year. And the way we talk about gender now is so radically different than the way that people were talking about gender in 1969. Which isn't to say that like Le Guin should be held to an impossible standard of perfection, especially when she had the humility and the good graces to, you know, kind of look back retrospectively and talk about the flaws of how she approached the text. But I think if anything, it speaks to how much The Left Hand of Darkness was really ahead of its time, you know,
Yes.
as a story investigating and trying to analyze and dissect and reimagine gender. And I think that, you know, Frank, it's always fascinating reading stories because I think that stories, unlike scientific research, unlike more like quantifiable, you know, a mathematical data, inspire our imaginations. And I think that when we think about gender in particular, a book like this, which so ruthlessly critiques gender, I think has the ability to really instigate a thoughtful reinterpretation or resituationing of what it means to approach the topic of gender. And unlike something like a scientific study or like a deep psychological analysis could do, like there's something about literature and about fiction and specifically like science fiction that's capable of conjuring these totally different worlds that I think really speaks to us reimagining and rethinking what gender is and how we understand it in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. I think that is like the main thing, because it is a product of its time and it's connected to like what it could do and what it couldn't do. But there's just so much like, because regardless of the mistakes, there is an honest and sincere approach to like rethink and like press on the question of like what the hell gender can mean, what it means for us, because like again like this speaks directly to its time and to our time still. along with pushing those boundaries a lot. So that is, and in a way that isn't like disingenuous, or that is like trying to, oh, this is what it is. It's like, well, it is many things, and it doesn't give a definite answer. And it presses the question, and I think that's like the best stance that one can have, and one that like literature and fiction definitely can do. That like proposing different questions, proposing different approaches, and it may offer ideas, it may offer different solutions and possibilities. And a lot of the time, if there is the sincerity and the humility of doing that writing and doing that work in fiction, then there is this possibility of like, well, it's an answer, and that's fine, and that's great, really, because it's pushing beyond what it can be. So while as we've been saying, we think about gender in a particular way that is even a lot more radical than we have here, the book itself offers a lot in what it's doing. That like it, because I'm deeply intrigued on how like it offers a certain angle of androgyny while working with having that differentiation, and while that is definitely very particular and very in a particular physiology that the book works with, it's again rethinking these preconceived ideas of what like gender can work with. And we have a particular experience, or we have other experiences now than we did back then, but these are still valuable, and they are still a lot more recent and a lot more fresh than at times like an academic work can have or not. Like that's like the power and the beauty of literature a lot of the time. And Le Guin definitely was aware of them. Like as I was talking about, like part of my research working with her, and the way she approaches her own text is incredibly fascinating. So I'm gonna pull up a quick quote, which I think definitely illustrates like what it can do. And I mean, I completely agree, even as a sort of like a historian, and like she's saying this in like 73, that like at this point, realism is perhaps the least adequate means of understanding or portraying the incredible realities of our existence. The fantasist may be talking as seriously as any sociologist, and a good deal more directly, about human life as it is lived, and as it might be lived, and as it ought to be lived. For, after all, as great scientists have said, and as all children know, it is above all by the imagination that we achieve perception and compassion and hope. And I think that's just, impeccable way of narrowing and bringing what literature can be a lot of the time, and just taking what it can do. And I think that is, that's one of the things that drives the left page and that drives me personally.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Frank. And I think that, it's well said. I do, though, think it's still fair to offer these critiques, right? Of how she portrays gender, because they are meaningful and they can still inform our own understanding of gender and our own kind of critical application of an exploration of gender in modern times. And so, like, you have this really great quote, from her essay, "Is Gender Necessary?" here in the notes, that I want to be sure we highlight, because it's just so good and really illustrates the humility with which she approached her own work and like the criticisms that she received. Anyways, she says, "I now see it thus. Men were inclined to be satisfied with the book, the Left Hand of Darkness, which allowed them a safe trip into androgyny and back from a conventionally male viewpoint. But many women wanted it to go further, to dare more, to explore androgyny from a woman's point of view as well as a man's. In fact, it does so in that it was written by a woman, but this is admitted directly only in the chapter The Question of Sex, the only voice of a woman in the book." Again, kind of interrupting her quote here. She does the same thing in The Dispossessed, where it's like non-linear and jumps around. Every other chapter is an intercession from some point in the cultural and historical and political background of Gethin, of Winter, of this planet. And so you get like spirituality and like lore, you get like notes on the reproductive cycle. You just get a whole bunch of like really fun stuff in the text. But the only chapter that's actually narrated by a woman is, I think it's like chapter 3 or chapter 4, the question of sex. Anyway, she continues, I think women were justified in asking more courage of me and a more rigorous thinking through of implications, which is, I think, true because as you pointed out, Frank, like there is a tendency to rely on like he, him pronouns instead of creating like an altogether new pronoun set or you just like defaulting to they, them. And I admit I'm not as, versed on queer theory as I probably should be. But my understanding is that even back in this time, people were using they, them pronouns, albeit like kind of like in very small niches and pockets.
Yeah, I think like historically, me neither, unfortunately, but I do definitely get that sense, especially from some of the commentary that she does, because the text is Gender Necessary Redux, which is a version from 1987, from the original text that's from 76, yes. It's the original text with, like, interspersed comments of us, and there's one that's like, I don't think the question of, like, the pronouns was important, and then her recent comment, I think that's very important now.
Right, yeah. Yeah, no, it's super interesting reading the Redux version where it's got all of her annotations and because like, and that's again, I think that's the mark of a true like mind is someone who is willing to do self-critique and like think back and reflect and be like willing to be like, okay, I fucked up here or I dropped the ball here or I fumbled here. There's some like Einstein quote about how like really critical minds are always doubting themselves, and I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. It may not even be Einstein. I may be pulling that out of my ass, but there is something to be said, I think, for her humility and her approach to her own writing and how she sees these works as like living texts, which is like fucking cool. Because like I feel like most authors have this very authoritative view, which makes sense. Like they're the author, like they created it. Like it's not. I don't necessarily fault them for this, but she's like willing to like kind of go back and tweak and rethink and respeculate. And I think that's really a really neat way to approach writing, especially as someone who studies literature, writes frequently. Yeah, it's just a really really cool kind of approach to thinking about one's own work.
Yeah, like it's this intellectual honesty, really, to like, yeah, this is what I did, and like now I would do it differently. I would do it really differently, but doesn't mean that like, oh, like it should. And I think that's the thing, that it doesn't mean that, oh, this is bad. No, like it has mistakes as a book from if she wrote it differently in 80s or in 84 or whatever, like it would have other mistakes and would have other things and so on. Like that's learning is a constant process of fucking up again in different ways.
Yeah, well said. Oh my god, that's so true. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse. I mean, I think that like obviously the topic and the theme of gender in this book has been discussed, ad nauseum, and I'm sure we'll circle back to it. Yeah. But do you want to explore some of the other like major things? Like I know you mentioned the Ecumen Council and talking about how they were analogous to the UN, and I think that is true in some sense, insofar as they say what you will about the UN, and I know this is like a right-wing talking point, but I'm gonna say it anyways. Like the UN doesn't have a lot of actual power, right? Nope. And in some ways, like the Ecumen Council is very much like that too. It doesn't really have a lot of power, but then again, it's not really interested in exercising power, and that I think is what's really fascinating about the Ecumen Council. This intergalactic association of worlds and peoples is that they're not interested in exercising power over each other. They're interested in communication. Because communication, as you'll recall from our discussion on the Dispossessed, is absolutely crucial to the Ansible. And what is it that Guin is utilizing in order to relay information back to the Ecumen but unanswerable, right? Like that's how he communicates back with the Ecumen. And so to me, I read the Ecumen Council as, and again, my biases come through here, but as a sort of proto-anarchic, like decentralized confederation, right? Not as much as like a UN, but like as a confederation of worlds and planets and peoples who are interested in communicating with each other and sharing information and sharing scientific exploration and cultural difference, but not trying to dominate or territorialize or do an imperialism. They're more interested in trying to understand each other and to communicate with each other. And that to me speaks to a sort of, like I said, like a decentralized internationalism or intergalactic internationalism. I don't know how to correctly phrase it, but it's such an interesting thing to consider, and it's very much like the kind of like the Star Trek approach.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, and I like that read. I like that read a lot more because as someone who has done like their fair share of UN simulations. Yeah, the UN doesn't have much power or any, so what can do. But yeah, especially in regards to like how this is referred various times in the book, and I really enjoy them. How they send one person, they send just one person, and like that person's in a pretty precarious and dangerous position, but it is one person. And they can decide to like pull back and then return, but it's just one person, and that the power and the potential that I can have of like just being a single emissary, not being an invasion force, not being an army, not being like even a delegation or something, or being a spy or whatever. It's literally one person, and that approach. That patient approach, I think that's something that we refer to as the Ecumen a lot of the time. That's like they're patient in their approach, in the time, in the communication, which implies a lot of like on this possibility of trust and communication, which it takes time. It takes time to establish any sort of bond, and I think that is something really interesting. I'm sorry, I'm slightly lost in thought, but I really do enjoy how, while we don't get a clear picture of the Ecumen or what they do, this potential of communication and exchange, which works its damn hardest to not be threatening, to not be imposing in any way, is so interesting. Like, that's why there's just one person beforehand who is literally scouting party to like, so this is this planet, this is their main settlements, this is their culture in broad strokes, and then they send one person to actually make that contact. It is definitely like to understand and taking the commitment to approach like, this is where I'm from, and you can believe me, you cannot, I can try and prove it best I can, but like, this is me. And this is who I represent. And it's really interesting. This is going to come up in a few months for another book that I've been reading. But I've recently read a short novella, a sci-fi novella, which is really interesting, which is called To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. And in it, there is an approach to like space exploration that like tries to decenter from humanity and like a non-threatening, non-intrusive, non-invasive approach. And the question of, but how can we observe while not interfering? And like, in a sense, that is a question there, and leans more towards like an observance that avoids all type of interference. In this, when there's a different culture, like the honesty and forthcoming of like, here am I, and here's who I represent, and this is what we're trying to do. Like this honest and upfront approach, I think reflects a lot of like what the Ecumen is trying to do, which is not like to deceive or to trick or to mislead, but to communicate in an honest way as possible. And in that regard, I think you're absolutely right in that idea.
Yeah, very true. No, I think you're absolutely right, Frank. And can you imagine how terrifying it would be to like be the person who has to go like make a connection with people for the very first time?
So much, like, because you put yourself on like it's such high risk. It's like anything could happen to me.
Yeah. Yeah, like, you know, you could get killed by the local population, you could die from exposure, your spaceship could, you know, malfunction. There's so many ways that could go awry, which is hilarious. But, you know, I think you're onto something, too, with the idea of how, in many ways, the Left Hand of Darkness prefigured the Dispossessed because, like, they come empty-handed, you know?
Yes.
They don't come with anything. The only thing that he has to communicate back with the Ecumen is the Ansible. That's it. You know, he literally comes to the people of Karhide empty-handed, which I think is like both very beautiful, but also like ties in this larger universe that Le Guin is constructing in the Hainish cycle. But yeah, I think that speaking of Karhide, there's also like something interesting to be said about like the way that Le Guin approaches these different civilizations from like a kind of anthropological view, and in some of the analogies that she draws, it's very clear. It's very clear, and you can love this or hate this, but it's very clear that Ursula K. Le Guin had more than a few criticisms of the USSR, especially as the closest analogy in both the Dispossessed and in the Left Hand of Darkness are both villainous. So like there's something to be said for that.
I definitely like that. Again, like in the analogies to like our societies, like the common point is the sort of analog to the USSR. So,
right.
You know, and in this one, it's even more present than in the Dispossessed, where in the Dispossessed, like, it's there, but it's a lot more in the background. Like, it exists, but it's not, like, at the forefront. It's not, like, the character that we follow doesn't literally go there, it doesn't exist there. So, there's definitely something to be said about her approach to it then, but here is like definitely at the forefront. Like this is the reference. This is the reference we're talking about, and it's, I think, fairly obvious. I will mention as an aside, because this boggled my mind how you could possibly have that reading, but that apparently someone reading the Dispossessed saw in an analog to the USSR, and I was like, wait, what? Okay, sure. But anyway, she works in analogies a lot of the time, and Karhide, in not being like a specific sort of feudal monarchy that we're talking about, can be a lot more interesting. And Orgoring, again, sorry for the pronunciation, as this USSR analog, definitely reflects a lot of the views of the time and lots of very fair and sensible criticism of it, and how it was seen, especially from the US at that time.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting approach to like counteract both like a feudal monarchy and bureaucratic USSR-like state. That's definitely interesting.
Yeah. Hey, Frank, I wanted to ask you too about the spirituality in this book, because you know, as I'm sure you're aware, Ursula K. Le Guin, I wouldn't necessarily call her a spiritual person, but she was very interested in the Tao Te Ching.
Yes.
And Taoism. You know, she was raised in like a Taoist household, and so spirituality definitely suffuses her work. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts on kind of how she fuses spirituality and scientific understanding within this text, because it's something that fascinates me about like these different like bases of knowledge, and how spirituality can make knowledge, and how how science can make knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, me being a relatively secular human being, I'm still fascinated by this fusion, and I think that so often people view it as a dichotomy where you're either spiritual or mystical or you're scientific. And I think that more and more as I've gotten older and considered things from multiple perspectives, I think that there's a dialectical synthesis here that she's kind of playing with in this text between science and spirituality. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how that plays out in the text.
Oh, a few at least. I guess it's not a question that, because for the longest time it's been the issue for me with my own spirituality as like Catholic Christian and communist, which is it was harder to think of back then, but like learning of like liberation theology and these various other possibilities and traditions has allowed me to like push those things together in interesting and again unexpected ways myself, but it's been possible. So this approach to like knowledge and understanding and effectively the philosophical question of like how do we produce knowledge, how do we approach knowledge and science is definitely one that this book pushed me and is pushing me to answer and to try to think about at least. Now that I have the previous one more or less like at least aligned in myself and not as a contradiction, which I never felt that it was, but like understanding that like no, there is no contradiction, or there needs to be no contradiction regardless. So for me, the matter of like, yes, you're absolutely correct, and like she says that multiple times in other texts, like her connection to Eastern theology and a lot of these different practices. But I do see, or like at least again a possible analog of that, like the Socratic maxim of like, I know that I know nothing, that ignorance and that humility to approach knowledge, any type of knowledge really, like that, of how do you build that, how you go about trying to understand and understanding that, like, I think it definitely circles back to that this spiritual connection to knowledge is seen in her own intellectual approach of like going back and understanding one's mistakes and trying to be honest and sincere about your work, which is this one that of unknowing, of ignorance, and not as a bad thing, because it's not an ignorance that is produced, is understanding an ignorance that is fact, that it exists, because it does. Like, there's the sum of knowledge that we don't know will forever outweigh the knowledge we do know. And that's just a part of human experience and creating and learning. And there's this conversation that, and it's definitely one of my favorite chapters, which is when, again, Lee is with this sort of spiritual group, which is the Handara. Again, like, think about pronunciation, but in it, he has a wide variety of conversations with them, and they have a sort of process and power of prophecy, where they can answer certain question. And in true, like, fairy tale fashion, like, they will answer only the question. So, like, how or what, like, it's intrinsically dependent on how you ask that question. And there are questions that cannot be asked, because they will incur in harm to those spiritually inclined to ask them. And that notion is really interesting. There are questions that have no definite answer, because it's always like a clear answer, even as simple or as empty as it might be. And again, he asks a question of like if his mission will be successful, and he gets that yes. And he afterwards, in thinking about it, it's like that it was the wrong question to ask. Like that didn't matter, that question. And the conversation that is the closing statement of that chapter is, yes, there's really only one question that can be answered, Henry, and we already know the answer. The only thing that makes life possible is permanent, intolerable uncertainty, not knowing what comes next. And I think to consider that as an approach to knowledge, to building, creating that scientific knowledge, really, it is one of we can create hypotheses, we can investigate, we can learn, we can create, we can consider, we can imagine. Again, the question of imagination, I think it's key here too. We don't effectively know. We can't attest with the utmost certainty or the matter of absolute truth. It's one is clearly dismissed this and that value of which comes up various times of nusuth, that it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter because it is, I think it definitely understands knowledge, and scientific knowledge especially, as something that changes, as something that is not fixed, that is not definite, and that is not permanent. It can last longer or shorter, and that's a more sincere and honest approach to scientific paradigms of, this is the prevailing view and prevailing understanding of it, and this upholds and sustains and makes sense given X, Y, Z, and a list of different points, counterpoints, and various evidences. But it is not absolute. And I think that definitely helps to establish and understand this, both the humility to time, to the universe, and while this does not show up in the text, to ecology, to ecosystems, to other forms of life, it is also one that understands that the creation of our knowledge and our approach to the world and to ourselves is one that will be forever changing and will be forever filled of things that we do not know, and some we won't know, some we might, and some we'll never know. But that is not a problem. I think this approach to an ignorance that will not be solved, but that will be occasionally shown or occasionally changing, is interesting than the absolute truth, absolute light. I feel silly that I didn't realize the obvious enlightenment metaphor, which is the one that is shown by the Orgoreins, which is this one of this all-seeing eye, this absolute light, and the other one is a sort of looking at this darkness and this ignorance, which is definitely a pressing question, and there was at the time, but it still is now, moving beyond or a more critical perspective against this enlightenment narrative of this absolute knowledge and absolute truth, which is one that is very dear to me, especially questioning these notions of progress and of these absolutes. So I'm sorry if I've been rambling a bit.
No. I mean, I think you're really onto something there, and it's one of the things that really appeals to me about the book. And when I read this with my students, I had them also read Donna Haraway's essay "Situated Knowledges," the science question in feminism, and essentially that text in that essay, Donna Haraway essentially argues that science heretofore, and she was writing it, I believe, in the 80s. She says that science heretofore has been an incredibly patriarchal and masculinist kind of approach to knowledge making. She says that science is the eye that fucks the world, which is what a fucking killer quote. But that science essentially is concerned oftentimes with trying to make sweeping, dramatic generalizations and statements as, like you said, as absolute truth, as facts, right?
Yeah.
And what feminism and what spirituality and what all of these other bases of knowledge making do is they encourage us rather to think about knowledge as something that is made, as ignorance as something that is generative, and as unknowing as just as important, if not more important, than knowing. And I think that that's all throughout this book. I mean, the book is called The Left Hand of Darkness, and so much of it is about Guin Liai's unknowingness about what's going to happen to him, about the people who inhabit Gethin, and really about what will be the future of this project that he's embarking on. Is his humble, tiny life going to make a difference? Is it going to be the change that invites Gethin into this larger council of intergalactic worlds? And I think that if we think about science as not being an absolute, but being as a partial estimation or our best guess, I think that's such a more healthy way of thinking about science. And in many ways, I think it's more honest to the scientific method. You know, the scientific method is all about critical inquiry, is all about trying to dismantle and rethink and reshape and be critical of knowledge that we have created. And so I think that it's such a shame that we don't teach science in that manner to young people, right? We don't teach it as what Marx would call the ruthless critique of all that exists. Rather, it's this very, you know, it's this very liberal approach to, like, I believe in the science, you know, like it's, you know, you hear people like Joe Biden being like, we believe in the science, and then they turn around and you know, do fracked gas and, you know, try to drill oil pipelines. You know, the idea of believing in science is just another belief system, and if we really think about science as one tool for understanding our place in the world and trying to analyze and dissect it, I think it's a much more enriching place to be. And again, like, you know, if it's funny that I'm saying all of this, because if someone had said the same thing to me even 5 years ago, I would recoil and be like, no, that's not true. Science is this blah blah blah. You know, I'd be an asshat about it. But it's so interesting thinking about how we as people can shift and change our views and perspectives, and how I think this book does such an excellent job of really reveling and finding joy in uncertainty, which I think is a very existential approach, and it's one that I don't think many people are comfortable with, because it's scary not knowing, you know, and I think that that's a fair response. Like, it does feel like being in darkness, to kind of, you know, return to that proverb that Ursula K. Le Guin writes in the book. But I think that there is a joy there as well, a freedom that comes from being unshackled to, like, the certainty of knowledge, and being able to fluctuate and move to different ways of knowing, different ways of being, different ways of experimenting with our understanding of the world. If not an absolute truth, then a truth that makes sense, and a truth that can speak to us in a meaningful and a concrete way.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it's just it's a slight tangent, but I think it makes sense to our whole point, that, like, for a long time I've been thinking about the matter, because, like, I'm a historian by trade, and the question of, like, is historical work, like, a scientific? Can it be scientific? And, like, yes, for those exact reasons. Because the arguments have historically been that, like, but it's interpretive, that it relates to, like, different views and peoples, and that you can't construct, like, a stable, impartial narrative, as if that's even possible in any of the other sciences. So, in a sense, like, there's a greater deal of honesty in understanding, especially historical work, but at the end of the day, all other sciences, that they take a particular approach in time and space. I am always intrigued and fascinated by these sort of unsolvable tensions of, like, in my case, that investigating the past and looking at different times by trying to understand them in their own time, but aware that I'm in my present. Because if I forget that I wear these goggles or these glasses of the present, then I'm living the past. Then I'm not doing this bridge. I'm not doing this connection. And if I don't approach this time on its own, then I'm literally not investigating. Then I'm just, like, evaluating from the present, and I'm not building this connection. I'm not understanding its own time. I'm outside it fully. So this tension, which one does not solve, one handles, one deals with, and that is present in sciences. And, like, the fact that we cannot establish absolute truths in history or in any of the other hard sciences, so to speak, is not a problem. That is actually just the process. It is a process. It's not, there's no real end point to it. It is this and I'm gonna say a contentious word, but not in the contentious sense, this revisionism of like going back and understanding anew, reinterpreting is not a bad thing. Like that's just the way this science is produced, no matter the field, that it builds and challenges past and present ideas in order to understand and build something new. And it's definitely something that's afforded when we understand like this darkness, and not just like, oh, we're not establishing like beacons or these absolute structures that will last. They'll last a while, but eventually they will crumble on the nature that they are. And to simply like believe is, well, that's that's hollow at the end of the day, because it contradicts the process in itself. It's interesting to go back on this question of process, but I think it's relevant considering the conversation we had on the Dispossessed. But this scientific discovery, creation, and imagination is one that is driven by a process, by what can be, what is, what isn't, and how these things change. So it's really the questions that were posed by this facing of ignorance in the text can be really constructive, not in a way that in a way that is sincere, really, that is sincere to how science can be produced, and in a way that is aware of its own contradictions and its own limitations, that it's humble at the end of the day.
I think you're absolutely right, Frank, and it's one of the reasons why I have bristled at even the jokes of like the immortal science of a certain social theory. It's not an immortal science. It is, especially if it's scientific, that is a paradox, right? Mm-hmm. The whole point is that that we should be constantly critiquing and rethinking and reimagining and reinterpreting our worldviews, our perspectives, our ideologies, our failed experiments and our successful experiments, and trying to synthesize and create new connections. And I think that there's definitely a lot of fertile ground for that sort of thinking when we just simply like let go and admit that the only thing that we know for certain is that we know nothing for certain at all.
Absolutely. As you said, that's liberating. That opens up so many new doors to focus on the idea of these fixed structures or these immortal things is, at the end of the day, it's counterproductive to the way that these things have been done, which is trial and error, which is contradiction, which is opposition, which is conflict, which is change. And embracing the possibility of that change is what allows, this production, reproduction, and creation in a varied and more interesting way, I think.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the relationship between Estraven and Genli, because I think it's one of the tensions in the book that is so fucking fascinating.
Yes.
And how these characters develop, how their relationship blossoms. It is so touching and so like poignant, and like every time I go back and reread this book, I can't help but like weep in its final moments because of the tragedy that unfolds. But like it's fascinating that like Estraven is the vehicle through which Genli learns to love the planet of Gethin and learns to understand the people of Gethin, right? There's this tension between the macro of the political and the social and the cultural being this thing that Genli is looking at through this like very anthropological lens, mm-hmm. and then it becomes personalized through the character of Estraven.
Yes,
and the relationship that develops between Genli and Estraven. It's Estraven who comes and saves Genli when he is imprisoned in Orgorain. It's Estraven who first tells Genli that he is under attack. And yet Genli is the one who is always skeptical of Estrevin because of his chauvinism, because of his misogyny, because of his sort of patriarchal conceptions of what gender is, and his inability to nail Estrevin down as male or female, right? Genli is not able to encode or put Estrevin into a box, which I think speaks to this larger conversation that we're just having about wanting to have that certainty, right? Well, Genli is not afforded much certainty on the planet of Gethin, regardless of whether it comes to gender or larger social and political mores. There is no real certainty in this text, and it's one of the things that I love about it so much, is that it is so very open to interpretation and understanding, and the way that Estrevin allows Genli to come to terms with gender, but also to come to terms with the peoples of the planet itself are so beautiful. And there are a few moments in literature that are as poignant and touching as the very, very small, almost so fast that you wouldn't notice it, like scene where Estrevin and Genli make love in this text. It's such a powerful moment, and yet it's so small, and yet it's really the fulcrum about which the entire text really swings, because it allows Genli to move from anthropological observer to someone who is deeply invested on a personal level in this project of inviting Gethin into the Ecumen Council.
Yes, and I think you put it perfectly. That's the way where he passes from just observer to someone who is effectively intervening in smaller or larger ways, but he is there as an outsider, but he is inside, he is invested, and he is changing things, regardless of how large or how small. Ultimately, he's proposing a colossal change, but a lot of the text he sees, and as you put it quite accurately, that he sees himself as an observer, as an outsider, as someone who is not understanding, who cannot encode these people for him the way that he is familiar, which is a sort of a binary. And at this final section of the novel, we do have these things sort of coming apart for him, as he's confronted literally face to face with this, that none of that really matters, and if that even made sense in the first place. And as these things sort of crumble for him, it allows him to fully engage with this is why I'm here, and allows him to go beyond what is familiar into this unknown, really, into this darkness. And in a way that is, at the end of the day, these experiences are always deeply changing if we allow ourselves to be open to them. And that's what happens to Genli at this beautiful, it's rough, it's difficult, and it's beautiful, and at the end painful journey of this through the ice, as they're together and exchanging and learning and experiencing together in their differences, and in a way, especially for Genli, in his humility, to finally allow himself to go beyond what he was trying to do the entire book, which frankly quite frustrating and a bit very annoying to read. That's trying to, but he's not particularly male, or that he's not particularly female, or he's being more female here, but and not just on Estrevin, but on a wide variety of characters. And at that point, he's he's neither, and he's both, and it doesn't matter. And that's excellent.
No, I couldn't agree more. And it's so fascinating, right, that it's he's both and he's neither, and it doesn't matter. It's all of those things simultaneously, which is super confusing, especially if you haven't read the text. And yet it synthesizes so brilliantly in those moments and in those chapters where Genli and Estrevin are out on the ice. and the way that they connect with one another is just super, super, super powerful. And it speaks, I think, to a transformative understanding of larger ramifications that Ginley hadn't considered, because I think that the text is intentional about making Ginley a bit of a chauvinistic pig.
Definitely.
in the beginning of the book, because it's supposed to indict the reader. I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin is, I think, very intentional about her audience. She's writing to an audience that she's assuming is largely cisgendered, largely like white, and largely male at this point in time, right? Mm-hmm. And she's inviting them to indict their own assumptions about gender and about masculinity and about the pureness of science, right? And like hard science fiction was like super big at this time, like the really rich, like, this is science fiction with an emphasis on the science part. And she's definitely indicting all of that in this book and complicating it. And I think that's one of the reasons why, it won a Hugo Award. I think it's one of the reasons why it's such a powerful and impactful text, is because it's not only a critique of all of these like larger ideas of certainty, of rationality, of science, and of masculinity, but it's also in many ways a critique of science fiction itself, which is fucking awesome. Like, like that's yet another level upon which, Ursula K. Le Guin's genius is playing out in this text, is that it's a critique of how science fiction looked at the question of gender, looked at the question of science, looked at the question of spirituality, and allowed it to kind of push beyond these very myopic understandings of masculinity and of the rigidity of science, but reclaimed a more authentic and feminist vision of what it means to actually engage in scientific inquiry, what it means to ask difficult questions and engage in ruthless critique, and also what it means to fuse different ways of making and understanding knowledge.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, because what she does here, and she does in different ways in Dispossessed, is questioning, in both cases, science fiction, and in the other one also utopian fiction, and like turning it in its head on how it's been done a lot of the time previously, and like showing, so this is what this can do, like, so let's do it differently, let's do it in other ways, let's use this with all the potential that it has to question our own reality and to imagine something new. And that's like, I think that's the absolute beauty of it, of like, and I go back to the quote I gave from her earlier, that it's like, it's hope. And especially recently, for me, it's been so crucial to everything I've been doing. That like, the way we operate and engage in different ways and with different things as critique in that as like a constructive process. Not in like, oh, constructive critique, yes, but what that means, and I'm directly pulling from something I was listening to before we recorded, which was one of the latest Horror Vanguard episodes, on critique as it builds something, as it builds a different understanding or greater understandings of something. It's not just a reaction, but it is a process of building as well. And I think that's what both of us do in our various works, and what we're doing now with this text, that it's like, this is what it does, this is what it can do, this is what it leads us, and this is what it helps us do. These are things that it intended, these are things that it did not, these are limitations, and these are not, but it's what it's pushing beyond, really. And in the way that we can, with this book, for example, like, go beyond, like, simple assumptions or simple ideas of, like, gender, of spirituality, of science, of communication, of experience, really. It's so interesting. I have separated a quote from Estrevan on Genly, and I think it illustrates a lot of, like, how Genly's behavior is, and it does not, and not justifying it, but understanding it in a way that, like, it makes sense to how Guin even unbuilds a lot of that knowledge. Here it is. There is an innocence in him that I have found merely foreign and foolish. Yet in another moment, that seeming innocence reveals a discipline of knowledge and a largeness of purpose that awes me. Through him speaks a shrewd and magnanimous people, a people who have woven together into one wisdom a profound, old, terrible, and unimaginably various experience of life. But he himself is young, impatient, inexperienced. He stands higher than we stand, seeing wider, but he is himself only the height of a man. And I think, as a way to widen all that we've been talking about, we are two men right here, right now, but we are constantly in our own ways pushing beyond those to other understandings, to other perspectives, to other ideas and other possibilities, and to make these connections to other peoples, other histories, other writings, other literatures. And it is this process, it is this wider idea of like what things can be, what can we be, and what can learning be, what can knowledge be, what can science be, what can spirituality be. So it is hope, it is imagination. And while this particular book narrows a few points, even going quite deeply into them on spirituality and gender and so on, it allows us so much more, and it's still constantly relevant, constantly interesting, constantly fun, and constantly touching. And yeah, it's incredible, and it's really interesting, and it's great to, again, I go back to this because I think in a lot of these discussions that I have, be it with you or with so many other guests, about what I have been doing and what the left page is supposed to do, which is to build and expand and produce different connections with these various texts. Yeah, I think that's it. It is about widening and about opening up these different ideas and possibilities that are to stop and think and talk about them, and like, this is interesting, or this isn't, or what can this be, or what can it shouldn't. So yes, a book like this that opens so many possibilities and doors in such touching and beautiful ways is truly an amazing read.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a beautiful and tender note to maybe wrap up on. What do you think?
Definitely, I agree. There's been so much more that we could expand and go into, but I think in order to drive the points that we've been making home and make it, these are questions that we'll still be thinking of, that it will still show up in our various projects and discussions.
Oh, for
and ideas.
sure. 100%, yeah. I don't think we're going to settle anything here today, Frank, unfortunately.
Afraid not.
Or perhaps fortunately, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it is actually a good thing that we're just asking more questions.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is a good point to end on so many new doors that this book opened and continues to open for us. And I think,
for sure.
Yeah, that's what always a good thing to do, to go to a text, to go to a book, to go to a story, and what can this open? And what does it open? And how can we have it open? And yeah, this is beautiful. So yeah, I think we can definitely sort of wrap up here. So where can people find you and support you, my friend?
People can check out Coffee with Comrades by going to www.coffeewithcomrades.com. We are a podcast that discusses theory and events and cultural criticism and direct action through a radical lens. We're available in any pod-catching app of your choice. You can also check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. I also recently joined a podcast called Macabre Media Podcast, which is hilarious. And so, fans of your show who are interested in cultural criticism might like Macabre Media Podcast, which again, you can find anywhere you get your podcasts. People who are fans of your show who are interested in the more political theory and action might be more interested in Coffee with Comrades, or people might dig both, which would be also awesome. But yeah, for folks who are listening to this episode in the Coffee with Comrades feed, Frank, where can people check out Left Page Pod?
You can find us on, wherever podcasts can reach you, at leftpage.libsyn.com, and I'm constantly on Twitter at leftpagepod, so you can find me there, usually retweeting other Comrades' work and podcasts and some of my own ideas, along with, we have a Patreon at patreon.com/leftpage, where we have some other texts that I write on either my own research or other texts that wouldn't necessarily show up as an episode, but they're still worth talking about, or that I may even talk about at some point, who knows. But it's another way that I'm producing and trying to connect with this knowledge regarding literature, reading, and writing, and along with the Poetry Club, where we delve into a poem for a bit, and it's weird and fun and interesting. So definitely check us out there too. And all the links will surely be in our descriptions. And definitely do check out Coffee with Comrades. Pearson does incredible work, and really happy and honored to be able to collab and chat with you again like this. It's so much fun. And do check out Macabre Media Pod. They're really fun, and this new season is being really interesting too.
Hell yeah. Well, thank you so much, Comrade. I appreciate the kind words. We're going to have to do this again sometime in the near future.
Absolutely.
And talk about another book in the heinous cycle. We're going to eventually, somewhere down the line, we'll get through all of them. But there's a whole fucking bunch of them, so maybe not.
Only time will tell.
I suppose that's true. And I guess if it's true that True Journey is returned, then we'll probably keep coming back to this series of books again and again and again.
I love that.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.
I want to fight my dream.
I die. My story has no end.